Almost 100 years had passed since the original crusade, when Jerusalem had been seized in an orgy of blood and fire, and a European kingdom built on its ruins. But now Saladin, the hero of Islam, had destroyed the Crusade kingdom's army at the Battle of Hattin, and had taken back Jerusalem. It was time for a new crusade, and a crusader to match Saladin. Richard the Lionheart, one of the stars of English history. Actually, he was French, Richard Coeur de Lion. He couldn't even speak a word of English. Nevertheless, for the Brits, he is the greatest hero of the Crusades. The world had changed since the First Crusade. This is a festival at Aigues-Mortes in southern France. After all, the French invented chivalry. The Crusader kingdom was called Outremer, France overseas. In fact, chivalry was really born in Outremer. That was where the once barbaric warriors of the West learned to enjoy luxury in imitation of the exotic courts of Syria. But one thing had not changed. Knights were still thugs who enjoyed beating the crap out of each other. That's why there was going to be another crusade. It was just that now they also wrote poems about doing it, and expected ladies to admire them for it. Richard doesn't seem to have been too bothered about the ladies. Richard became King of England in 1189. He also ruled half of France, and there were rumours that he was the lover of the King of France, Philip. Public opinion had been scandalised that no one had gone to the rescue of the Holy Land. Well, Richard was just the man for the job, but he couldn't go without Philip. They were quite a pair. Richard, glamorous and dashing, Philip, one-eyed and cautious. They were supposed to be best friends, but in fact, neither dared leave the country on his own for fear that the other would take the opportunity to seize their lands. Eventually, Richard and Philip met at Vézelay and agreed to join forces to go to the rescue of the Holy Land. Meanwhile, they had raised a fortune for the war. Richard's money-raising for all this became legendary. His one realisable asset was England, a place that bored him rigid. It rained all the time, it was full of sheep, and the inhabitants couldn't understand a word you said to them.
Où est le patron? Où est le patron?
And you couldn't even enjoy a good scrap because tournaments had been banned there. But it was notoriously prosperous because of the wool trade, and Richard was prepared to cash in the lot. He made everyone pay a new tax, the Saladin tithe, and he was ready to sell off royal lands, castles, and even whole cities. Richard, you see, had his own privatisation programme.
I would sell London if I could find a buyer.
Richard need all this money for? Well, I suppose it's over 50 years since the last crusade, so maybe the technology of warfare's moved on a bit. Probably cost a bit more. Well, to find out, I've come here in Nottinghamshire to talk to Frank Craddock, who's probably the last man in England who could actually fit out a crusading army. Frank, I don't really see what's so expensive about all this armour stuff. I mean, it's only somebody banging away on a few bits of metal here.
That's just the popular impression of it, the cross between the Jolly Green Giant, Rambo and Conan the Barbarian thundering away with a blasted great 2-kilo hammer on a piece of hot metal. It didn't actually operate like that. It's actually a very delicate operation. The armourer who was producing was actually producing very fine, delicate rings, for example, like this, and riveting them together, very tiny rivets.
But that means every single ring has been riveted and then...
Yeah, somewhere in the region in this, probably about 60,000, 70,000 rings. It's double chain. It's double thick.
You get a blind doing this, aren't you?
Yeah, child labour was used on occasion for doing it, and people could go blind, especially in working bad lighting conditions.
So what's that going to set me back then? Riveted mail.
Suit of riveted mail, armour, helmet, your sword, and the price of a good 4-bedroom house these days. Yeah, not cheap. The equivalent price.
Yeah.
You know, it's the army you're wearing now.
Good stuff.
Totally wrong.
What's wrong with it?
It's absolutely wrong for the third period. Helmet is essentially a Norman helmet. By that time it had been converted into a potty for some kiddie or something like that, or a cooking utensil. This, your sleeves are too short.
This was good enough for the first crusade.
Yes, it was, but that was years ago. So essentially you need a total new suit. From start to finish, new weapons, all the way through.
We're going to do it then.
Let's go.
Bloody hell.
There you go.
So this is what a well-dressed 12th century knight would have been wearing, is it?
Yeah, that's basically what he would have been wearing for Richard's crusade, with certain exceptions. Right, let's here's a pig sticker. This sort was going out of fashion amongst the knights of the period, the high-ranking ones. It was too short. You can't reach down there. You're leaving over the head of your horse and breaking your arm trying to get at him.
What do I have instead?
Well, you're going for a longer one, a sword of war.
Ooh, I like that. Ooh, that's very nice, isn't it?
That's far better forged.
Beautiful, isn't it?
Which is longer, gives you the reach.
It's a bit heavy. I mean,
Yeah, it's heavy. It's a sharpened crowbar, it's heavy, but it gives you that reach to cut downwards with great weight.
I see what you mean. Up on my horse there, and
That's
just
it.
slack away at the old peasant down there. Yeah. This is the kind of thing. Richard would definitely have one of these, I think, wouldn't he?
Dickie would have been swinging one of those at All and Sundry. Yeah.
Philip and Richard's crusade was a professionally organised royal project, not a mass movement like the original crusade. The Third Crusade, all the sources talk about the numbers. Often from certain areas, in Yorkshire, a lot of crusaders for some reason go from Yorkshire. But we're talking about thousands, not tens of thousands. So if we're talking about thousands in a population of 1.5, 2 million, that's the sort of level of involvement. They were going to a shattered kingdom. The kingdom of Jerusalem had disappeared. All that remained of it was a tiny enclave around the port of Tyre. But no one was giving up. In fact, the survivors had spent 2 years besieging the next port along, Acre, trying to recapture it. Acre was a city that was created and destroyed by the Crusades. When Richard and Philip arrived, this very citadel was in the hands of Saladin's troops. They'd been under siege by the local Franks for the last 2 years. It had dragged on that long because the defenders could always get supplies in by sea. However, Richard and Philip had a big enough fleet to be able to stop all that sort of nonsense. They also started battering the city walls with huge siege engines, which they gave exotic names like God's Own Catapult and Bad Neighbour. Hey! By now, siege artillery was capable of inflicting serious damage. As large beams were now being shipped into the Middle East from Europe, the payloads rose towards 1/4 of a ton, enough to damage any wall. Eventually, on the 12th of July, 1191, the Saracen garrison decided they'd had enough and capitulated. It was agreed that the Muslims would be set free in return for 200,000 gold dinars, 1,500 Christian prisoners, and the holiest of holy relics, the fragment of the true cross that Saladin had captured at Hattin. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out like that at all. You see, the garrison had come to these terms without actually referring to Saladin, and there was no way he could raise that sort of money in the time. Eventually, Richard, who was impatient to get on to Jerusalem, and who didn't want to be encumbered with nearly 3,000 prisoners, grew tired of waiting for his money. So he simply had the entire garrison chained up outside the city walls, along with their wives and family, and slaughtered. It took 3 days to kill them all. Anyone who believes the Crusades were bold and heroic needs to justify the cold-blooded murder of men, women and children who were too much of a nuisance to keep alive. No Muslim army had ever treated Christians with this mechanical barbarity. Acre offered comfort and relaxation. After the rigours of war came the pleasures of a large port.
Tinted and painted, desirable and appetizing, bold and ardent, with nasal voices and fleshy thighs, they offered their wares for enjoyment, brought their silver anklets up to touch their gold.
This is Saladin's secretary describing a boatload of European prostitutes. Plainly, he never got invited to these sorts of parties. Western historians insist that it was all in his imagination. But then maybe they don't get invited to them either.
They interwove leg with leg, caught lizard after lizard in their holes, guided pens to inkwells, torrents to the valley bottom, swords to scabbards, firewood to stoves, and they maintain that this was an act of piety without equal, especially to those who were far from home and wives.
While at home, according to popular belief, their wives were locked away in chastity belts.
I don't think there's anything in the idea that wives of crusaders were locked into chastity belts. Genuine chastity belts do not survive. There is an account of the siege of Lisbon on the Second Crusade, where the Moors on the walls taunt the crusaders by reminding them what their wives might be getting up to at home. The main danger for the crusader's wife was that she would actually be attacked, either legally and her property taken by somebody else, or physically. There are a number of occasions where crusaders' wives are murdered for their property while their husbands are absent. It was quite risky to be a crusader's wife.
The main risk for a crusader was disease of all kinds. Philip became very ill and decided he'd had enough. Richard figured that he still had time to catch Jerusalem and get back to defend his lands from Philip, but he had to move fast. Richard found it hard to drag his men away from the delights here at Acre and begin their long march of reconquest, especially since he forbade any women on the march apart from washerwomen, who, quotes, would not be a burden to them nor the occasion of sin. Sir Stephen Bunceman, in his marvellous 3-volume history of the Crusades, quotes from about 275 modern studies on the subject. And in the 40 years since he wrote that, there have been about another 400 books published about the Crusades. And yet, in all these 700 learned tomes, not a single scholar has even begun to explain why washerwomen were not the occasion for sin. There clearly needs to be a lot more research on the subject of Crusader washerwomen. At the siege of Antioch, when the Crusaders were starving and desperate outside the city and needed to build up their bank balance of divine approval, they ejected all the prostitutes and naughty ladies from the camp. But the washerwomen stayed. Henry II of England, when he was planning a crusade, which he never made, announced that the only women who would be allowed to go would be washerwomen. And after almost every major battle, almost the first thing that either side would do would be to ransom its captured washerwomen. What on earth was so special about these ladies?
The idea was that crusaders should abstain from sex during the crusade. It was a penitential activity after all. It was convenient, of course, as an excuse for failure, the fact they didn't abstain from sex, and defeats are often attributed to the lust of the crusaders. Washerwomen were allowed in the army because they were old, ugly or not, but they were extremely important in making the lives of the crusaders less hellish by regularly delousing them.
After leaving Acre, the washerwomen walked south along the shore, along with the baggage train. They were protected by knights riding inshore and by the infantry marching even further inshore. Offshore, they were accompanied by the fleet, who provided them with all their supplies. There were some attacks on the baggage train and on the washerwomen, but the knights drove them back and cut off a few heads, which they hung from their saddles, which, as you can imagine, all makes work for washerwomen. When the Muslims did capture a few prisoners, Saladin had the soldiers executed, but I'm happy to tell you that the washerwomen he returned safe and sound back to Richard's army.
Richard was marching 60 miles down the coast to the port of Jaffa. From there he could strike inland to Jerusalem. For 2 weeks his army marched in perfect formation down the coast, and there was nothing Saladin could do to stop them. The key was discipline, the new expensive armour, and felt. The felt makers were the real heroes of the story. Every foot soldier wore armour made of very heavy felt, and so stout a coat of mail that our arrows did no harm. Our saw soldiers with as many as 10 arrows in their back, who marched on as usual without breaking rank. One could not help admiring the patience of these people. Richard reached Jaffa safely. He was master of the coast. Now he was ready for the march inland to recapture Jerusalem. But Saladin's power inland remained intact. Even if Richard managed to capture the city, Saladin would just retake it again when he left. It was obviously pointless. Richard desperately needed a treaty with Saladin that would let him off the hook.
Men of ours and of yours have died. The country is in ruins. and events have entirely escaped anyone's control. Do you not believe that it is enough? Let us put an end to this exhausting struggle.
This land has always been ours, and your occupation is only for a short while. So long as there is war, we will not allow you to enjoy your possessions.
We must meet to discuss all these things.
Kings meet only after they have agreed. In any event, we need a translator in whom we both have confidence. Let that man, then, act as a messenger between us. When we have arrived at an understanding, we will meet, and friendship will prevail between us.
Richard and Saladin never actually met, but they did communicate via a go-between. This was Saladin's brother, Aladil. Now, Richard and Aladil got on rather well. In fact, they got on so well that Richard seems to have forgotten what the whole war was meant to be about. Not only did he knight one of Aladil's sons, but in October 1191 he made a startling proposition. In order to solve the entire Palestine question, Richard proposed that his sister Joanna should marry Saladin's brother. The two of them could then jointly rule Palestine. End of problem. It didn't happen. And one Arab historian, Professor Zakar, has evidence that puts a sinister interpretation on this story. A number of first-hand accounts, some of them unpublished, show that Aladil was trying to seize the kingdom from his brother, Saladin.
Salah ad-Din, why he should sign a treaty with Richard Coeur de Lion, since Richard leaving the country and going back to Europe, and leaving only a few hundreds people at Acre. This man who was the great champion of the day of Hattin, why he should make a treaty with Richard if he was not facing a real troubles at home?
Saladin had to make a treaty with Richard before his brother did. Otherwise, he might find that he had lost his kingdom. And Richard also needed a treaty. There was no point in him conquering Jerusalem unless he was going to stay for the rest of his life defending it. He went back to Acre and prepared to go home. A faith-saving peace treaty was virtually complete when suddenly Saladin's army attacked and seized Jaffa. Saladin had lost control. His troops massacred the men inside. They wanted revenge for Acre. In fact, Saladin was so alarmed at what was happening that he told the Christian garrison to shelter inside the citadel until he could regain control of his army.
Richard sailed quickly down from Acre with a small force. But when he reached Jaffa, he didn't dare land because he didn't know what the situation was in the town, until a priest managed to swim out and tell him that the garrison was still holding out. Whereupon Richard stripped off his leggings and waded ashore at the head of his men. Now, the locals tell us that this is strictly impossible. They say, if you jump into the sea here on the beach at Jaffa in heavy mail armour, you'll either sink into the sand or you'll get knocked over by the waves. So we're going to carry out a historical scientific experiment. In the persona of Richard the Lionheart, I'm going to see if it is possible to invade Jaffa from the beach. So, wish me luck, chaps. Where are we? Here we go. Go. Right. Well, I haven't sunk into the sand so far, and so far I haven't been knocked over by waves. So it looks like it's going to be A definite, yes, it's possible!
I don't know whether I had to reach the line, hello?
No one is held in esteem until he has blows both given and taken. I tell you that nothing so satisfies me.
Open the
None of these joys do I find what I feel when I hear the sound of aftermath.
Richard camped outside the walls of Jaffa, but Saladin struck back. He had over 7,000 cavalry, whereas Richard could only manage about 54 knights with mere 15 horses between them and 1,500 infantry. It was the stuff that legends are made of.
Never was there such an attack made by an individual. He pierced into the middle of the hostile army. Our men, losing sight of the king, were fearful lest he should be slain. But King Richard, inured to battle from his tenderest years, and to whom even famous Roland could not be considered equal, remained invincible, even in the midst of the enemy. And his body, as if it were made of brass, was impenetrable to any kind of weapon. In his right hand he brandished his sword, which in its rapid
is the dart of the ditches, and when I see dead men who still have pen and lances in their ribs.
We have to distinguish between two things, romance and real history. When we want to distinguish between romance and real history, we have to use more than one source, and in many languages. First of all, this manuscript hasn't been published before. It is the first time, edited and now handed to the press by me. Saladin ordered his men to capture Richard Coeur de Lion. They refused his order.
Saladin's own soldiers refused?
Yes, they refused. That man lost his control upon his armies and lost his control upon his own household.
So, the great battle must have been improved on by the chroniclers. Most of Saladin's army had mutinied and refused to fight Richard. Both sides needed to bring the war to an end. Finally, a deal was agreed on. Saladin would allow Christian priests in the holy places and would let the Crusaders keep the coast as long as Richard dismantled the fort that he'd built at Ascalon. On the 28th of August, 1192, the treaty was signed. Many Crusaders visited Jerusalem as Saladin's guests, but Richard had sworn only to set eyes on the city as its conqueror. He set out for home. His journey home was erratic. He was found travelling in disguise through Austria. He was seized for ransom.
Richard was an extremely undesirable man. He was a bad son, a bad husband, very bad ruler. But he was a magnificent soldier who took a great deal of trouble over his men. So in a way it was easy to make a hero of him.
While Richard languished in jail, waiting for someone to pay his ransom, and, according to legend, being hunted down by his faithful minstrel Blondel,
and bastions broken down and shattered,
Saladin died. Saladin became a legend in Europe. To the preachers, he was Antichrist, but to many others, he represented the essence of chivalry, the model of the perfect knight. When Richard had been sick, Saladin had sent him a doctor and snow to cool his fever. And in war, he protected defeated civilians from his own soldiers.
I think he deserves the admiration of a man like Richard the Lionheart and many
Crusader knights, who really believe that he is maybe even the ultimate symbol of knighthood of the Middle Ages. He's one of my greatest heroes. Saladin had no interest in personal wealth. He didn't own a single house, and when he died, even his shroud had to be borrowed. He is a mystery, right down to the fact that he has 2 tombs. And we don't even know which one he's actually buried under. Even when he's dead, it's still impossible to pin the man down. The 2 tombs of Saladin also represent 2 different perceptions of the man. This rather homely wooden one is the tomb his fellow countrymen put up to him after he died. But the West always had a higher opinion of Saladin than that, and sometime in the last century the German Kaiser insisted on putting up this marble monstrosity to him, to commemorate Saladin as the West sees him, as one of the great romantic heroes of history.
People not only think about him as something out of the past, people normally when they think about figures like this, somehow, in their minds he continues to exist. So in some manner or another, they also always hope for his reappearance, especially now, of course, with the problem that we have with Israel over Palestine.
حسب العدا يا صلاح الدين حسبهم.
Saladin is a hero for diplomats, not for hardliners. He didn't drive the kingdom of Jerusalem into the sea. Perhaps that's why the West has been very keen for Arabs to idolize him. But Saladin has never been the true hero of the Arab story of the Crusades. That was a man whose name is blotted out from Europe's memory.
الملك بيبرس. الله أكبر. جيش مدى عند الصباح المستري.
Baybars, not Saladin, is the hero whose deeds have been told ever since by the Kafi storytellers of Syria. Baybars was as merciless and brutal as the Crusaders themselves, but what he achieved lasted a lot longer. Europe never had any intention of respecting the peace with Saladin. The Church couldn't tolerate peace with Muslims. It would take 50 years of provocation by the Christians to produce a man like Baybars.
Oyez, oyez, gentes dames, le noble seigneur, les cavaliers voltigeurs de France!
It's November 1199. A group of French knights meet at a tournament and decide, in effect, to sell tickets for a package crusade. The aim? To attack the wealth of Egypt and then go on to Jerusalem. The organizers sent agents to Venice to negotiate the contract for ships and supplies, and this is where it all started to go wrong. The Venetians drew the Crusade negotiators into a fantasy world. The negotiations were handled by a blind 80-year-old merchant, Enrico Dandolo, the Doge, the ruler of Venice. His plan was to seduce the crusade into bankruptcy and take it over. The organizers entered the world of make-believe. Dandolo talked them into contracting for 3 times as many people as had been on Philip and Richard's crusade, and at 6 times the cost. They did not understand what was really happening. You see, Venice did good business with the Arabs and promised the Egyptians the crusade would never arrive. Everything the Crusaders were being offered had an illusory quality. Right now, it was theirs, but when the clock struck midnight, they would be up the proverbial canal without a pumpkin.
Well, the Crusade leaders arrived in Venice feeling very pleased with themselves and waited for their 33,000 troops to join them.
The paying customers began to arrive and were accommodated in the luxury they expected. They were, of course, on an island, and they had no way of getting off. But they didn't think of themselves as prisoners, yet. But it gradually became clear that instead of 33,000 Crusaders, there were only about 10,000.
Well, the Venetians gave the Crusaders everything they asked for, but unfortunately they'd asked for a bit too much. And as every Crusader was meant to be paying his own way, they needed at least 3 times as many Crusaders to pay the bill.
The Crusaders were deep in debt to the Venetians and had no idea how to pay. And then the old Doge of Venice suddenly appeared with a totally unexpected offer. He was over 80 and totally blind, but he was nobody's fool.
Son vecchio! Sono cieco! Ma vi ordino questa crociata!
He had a cross fixed to his skull cap where everyone could see it, and thousands of Venetians joined the crusade. But Doge Dandolo was not leading them to Egypt or to Jerusalem. He was leading them to a conquest that would pay off their debt and make him master of immeasurable wealth. In a great eastern city there had been a revolution. The deposed heir was offering a fortune to be put back on his throne. This was the greatest prize in the world, and the Crusaders would take it for Doge Dandolo. Constantinople, the mightiest of Christian cities, the city which had begun the Crusades 100 years before by asking for help against the Turks, was now to be attacked by the very forces designed to protect them. The city was weakly defended, and the deposed heir was given back his throne, but there was no money to pay the Crusaders. So they tore the city to pieces. The sack of Constantinople was the most grotesque of all the barbarous acts of the European barbarians. Logic and religion were used to justify everything. These were barbarians with theology. Killing Byzantine Greeks might be a moral duty and, of course, a pleasure. But the money was what mattered.
Geoffrey de Villadouin here declares that to his knowledge so much booty had never been gained
in any city since the creation of the world. The treasures of the great church of Hagia Sophia became loot, gold for the knights, holy relics for the priests who blessed them. The priests found arguments to justify every outrage. They declared that the Crusaders had completed their vows as if they had conquered Jerusalem. And a prostitute sat on the patriarch's throne.
Well, now roll, Jordan, roll, roll, Jordan, roll. I want to go to heaven when I die to hear my Jordan roll. When I roll, Jordan, roll, roll, Jordan, roll. I want to go to heaven when I hear my Jordan roll. Everybody! Brother, won't you be there? Yes, my Lord.
This was the end of the great journey to save Jerusalem and make the world into Christ's patrimony. Not a single Muslim died at the hands of the Fourth Crusade. The stolen treasures were carried back to Venice, where they are still proudly displayed. The treasury of St. Mark's in Venice contains the last remnants of the wealth of Byzantium. The horses of Constantine's hippodrome were brought back to look out over St. Mark's Square. And in Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, once the greatest church in Christendom, the old blind Doge was finally laid to rest, his niche in history assured. A more savage enemy of the church than any Islamic conqueror. The Muslim world was unharmed, but the remnant of the Crusader state was as fragile as ever. Its strongholds had thick walls, but were thinly manned. Their survival depended on peace. But the West was locked in a strange fantasy of Christian chivalry, celebrated in stories and ballads. These puppets are Sicilian.
Figliati saraceni, venite a provare il taglio della mia spada blindata.
In 1218, there was a crusade against Egypt. In 1239, there was another. In 1248, there was another. Even when Islamic leaders offered to give back Jerusalem in order to get some peace, they were spurned. A good Christian did not negotiate with Muslims. He tried, ineffectually, to wipe them out. Eventually, the Egyptian army had had enough. In 1250, a group of revolutionary soldiers seized power in Egypt. Saladin's family were kicked aside. The message now was no more Mr. Nice Guy. The leader of the coup was a slave, Baybars.
الملك بيبرس والأرض ترج من تزلزل ركضها وكذا حوافر خيلنا بالمحجر عادل المنصور من زلت له جمع اللئام بكل واد أخضر.
Baybars was leader of the Mamluks. Now the Mamluks were these slave soldiers of Egypt. Generally they were captured as small children and brought back to Egypt to be trained up exclusively as warriors. They knew of no other life except warfare. And what's more, they'd been hardened in over 100 years of battles with the Crusaders. Under the leadership of Baybars, the Mamluks swept everything before them. They created a state whose whole purpose was war. One of the first targets was Antioch. Once it was captured, the gates were sealed and every Christian, man, woman and child was butchered. The Christian prince of Antioch wasn't there, so Baybars sent him a letter telling him what he'd missed.
You would have seen your knights prostrate beneath the horses' hooves, your houses stormed by pillagers and ransacked by looters. You would have seen the crosses in your churches smashed, the pages of the false testament scattered, the patriarchs' tombs overturned. You would have seen your Muslim enemy trampling on the place where you celebrate the Mass, cutting the throats of monks, priests and deacons upon the altars. Since no survivor has come forward to tell you what happened, we have informed you of it. And since no one is in a position to give you the good news that you have saved your life at the loss of everything else, we bring you the tidings in a personal letter.
The Mamluk war machine moved from town to town, from castle to castle, tearing stone from stone and killing the inhabitants, destroying the last remnants of the Crusader kingdom. Its final stronghold was here in Acre, by this time the most corrupt port in the Mediterranean, a penal colony filled with wrongdoers from all over Europe, sent to the Holy Land for the good of their souls. They never stood a chance. Just as the Christians had once bathed Jerusalem in Muslim blood, now the stones of Acre ran red as Christians were butchered. The Mamluks then destroyed every building and all the vegetation right down the coast, creating a desert which offered no toehold for any future crusade. Further inland, churches were turned into mosques. Even in the mightiest Crusader fortress, the call to prayer now sounded. It took 200 years for the Crusaders to create this Islamic fanaticism, but they had done it. It was an imitation of their own intolerance. I suppose one of the great gifts of religion is that it provides us with certainty in this uncertain and temporary situation in which we find ourselves, called life. The only snag is that religion seems to make some people so certain that they're prepared to do terrible things to other people. This is certainly the story of the Crusades. Probably most Crusaders set out with the intention of doing good, and yet they ended up perpetrating one of the great crimes against humanity.
What's more, the entire enterprise was a total failure. The net result of all their efforts was the exact opposite of what they'd set out to achieve.
Islam, far from being destroyed, learned to imitate Europe's rage. Constantinople, far from being saved, never recovered. Today, of course, it is a Turkish city, Istanbul. And 900 years after it all began, the world still lives in the long shadow of the Crusades.
عليك وعلى آلك وأصحابك أجمعين. الله أكبر الله أكبر.